Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Science Policy Research Unit, since I've learned a great deal over the years from the scholarship produced here. So this talk is going to be a little bit of a dog's breakfast, because I'm covering a number of little different pieces, and that I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to the inclusive growth theme. What I'm really trying to do here is give a kind of story about how the U.S. innovation system actually works. So I think that the basic idea is I'm trying to give an overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the key programs in the U.S. system, and then talk a little bit about the difficulties, the problems, the fairly severe crisis that the U.S. innovation system faces. So the kind of story that I tell in the article that Mariana kindly mentioned, I use this term, the hidden developmental state, to describe what exists in the U.S. And the storyline is that despite all of the free market rhetoric for the last 30-odd years, going back to Reagan, the U.S. took a developmental framework that had been developed in the military sector by the Pentagon, particularly by this particular agency, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, like the cafe that we're going to afterwards, DARPA. And they've used that technology very purposefully to drive the innovation process in the private sector. And but the amazing thing about this system is that it exists very much under the radar. It exists under the radar because it conflicts with this dominant free market ideology, so people don't want to talk about it. So, I've been trying to drag this hidden developmental state out into the sunlight, and it's a very hard struggle. I mean, so I was saying that we published this book a couple of years ago, and miraculously the book has been out for 2 years, and nobody's bothered to review the book. I mean, and in the U.S. I mean, so it kind of gives you an indication that it's a little bit like being a skunk at a picnic. Basically, the story that I'm trying to tell about the U.S. is that in some ways it's an old story, because the U.S. has a very long history of use of a developmental state that goes back to the early days of the Republic. Again, this is a history which is substantially forgotten, repressed, or whatever, but the historians of technology have shown that the interchangeable parts for mass production in the middle of the 19th century, wasn't invented by Eli Whitney. It was invented in a government armory that was making rifles. And that use of military procurement to drive technological change has been part of the history, along with building of infrastructure and so forth. So I could go on about that, but maybe we'll come back to it. Okay, so in the 20th century, I identify 3 key turning points. The first is obviously World War II itself, because up until World War II, the scientific and technological resources under the U.S. Federal government are still quite limited. They set up the Naval Research Laboratory in the 1920s, but basically there wasn't a lot of science capacity within the ambit of the federal government before that. And you remember the famous story where Einstein and the other nuclear scientists go to the Roosevelt administration and they say, hey, there's this thing called nuclear power. We think that the atom can be split to make a terrible weapon. That moment, which gave rise to the Manhattan Project, that was really the last moment at which the U.S. state was taken by surprise by cutting-edge science and technology. After that, through the creation of a national laboratory system that grew out of the Manhattan Project, and then after World War II, the creation of the National Science Foundation, the federal government became the basic funder of basic scientific research, and they knew what was going on. They weren't, so when biotechnology comes along in the 1970s and 80s, the federal government knows exactly what's happening. They're anticipating the gene splicing 5 or 10 years before it actually happens. So the second of these turning points was the creation of DARPA in 1958. It was a response to the Soviet launching of Sputnik. The US government recognized that there was this military procurement going on, but it was driven by the armed services. It was short-term. DARPA was given the assignment to look over the horizon, to invest in technologies that might not pay off militarily for 15, 20 years down the road. And what happened at DARPA was that they went out, they created a very lean bureaucracy, program officers with a lot of authority, a lot of independence. They hired top scientists and engineers to staff these offices, gave them a lot of discretion, minimum of paperwork, and they said, go out and make things happen. And it was DARPA that essentially drove the computer transformation. By 58, there were big mainframe computers. Most of them had been bought by the government for military and space purposes, but that DARPA focused on computer science. They created the computer science departments. They created the first connection between those computer science programs, which was called the ARPANET or DARPANET, which ultimately became the internet that we all know and love. That the kind of next step in the argument is that in that period from 79 to 89, from the Carter administration through the Reagan administration, what happened in Washington, this was the same time that the US was having a competitiveness debate, a lot of anxiety about Japanese economic advances, particularly fear that US was in decline. And there were strong arguments for industrial policy, which were ultimately defeated, but that politicians in both parties essentially got the idea that what DARPA had done with computer science and that the National Institutes of Health had done with biotechnology, which was essentially use this decentralized network forms to drive innovation, was a technology that could be used across the federal government. And so essentially, they passed a series of pieces of legislation that were designed to take advantage of US leadership in scientific and technological research to drive the production of commercial products and improve US competitiveness through that mechanism. So let me just emphasize that the DARPA model was a real significant difference from what had been done before, because it incorporated this network model, that the DARPA program officers would identify a problem like the need to develop a good user interface for these early computers, and one that was easy for people to access who hadn't learned some obscure computer code. And so what they would do is they would dole out money, some to universities, some to small firms, some to big firms. They would get all of those people into some kind of collaboration where they were sharing ideas. They would give additional funding to the people who were making progress, and by that means they were essentially accelerating the movement of these ideas into the commercial space. And I don't know whether this story is familiar on this side of the Atlantic, but basically DARPA funded this research lab in Silicon Valley, the Xerox PARC lab, where many of these key breakthrough technologies were developed: the graphical user interface, the mouse, the Ethernet connections, and so forth. And part of the US story is that at some point, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were given tours through Xerox PARC, and essentially that this was before the emergence of the personal computer. Jobs and Gates saw what Xerox PARC had developed and said, hey, that's really cool stuff. We could make a lot of money, and essentially they did. I mean, they basically borrowed those technologies. Later on claimed all of this had been done by the private sector, but it had really been done through DARPA funding that had built the infrastructure at Xerox PARC. Okay, so this last thing about overcoming network failures is kind of one of the theoretical kind of tools that we've been pushing. Essentially, the idea, which you see clearly in the computer industry, but you see it across many innovative sectors now, is that innovation, the moving of new products to the market, is very much a network phenomenon. It's not any longer done within a vertically integrated firm. It requires these network connections among many firms, connections to universities, to government, and so forth. And essentially, the idea is that the DARPA program officers from an early point saw part of what they were doing as strengthening these network connections, building up the bandwidth, as it were, of these networks. Now, let me just make one kind of footnote here, which is essential in terms of kind of putting this into comparative perspective, because one of the things which is important to say is that this system that the U.S. develops is developed upon this base of a very high level of federal government R&D spending from the starting point, which was very much a legacy of the Cold War. That we had this huge defense system and a lot of spending on R&D. So just to give you an order of magnitude, in the last year, total federal R&D spending in the U.S. was on the order of $134 billion. I looked for the equivalent UK figure, and it's on the order of 10 billion pounds, or $17 billion. So the kind of clearest way to think about the comparison is that the federal R&D spending in the U.S. as a percent of GDP is 0.34%. Not that large, but in the UK, the comparable figure is 0.17%. Now, so essentially, we're talking about a baseline of twice as much of a research and development apparatus that's includes public sector laboratories, university-based research, various other kinds of programs. That obviously you have to adjust there that the U.S. flushes away a lot of money on crazy scientific white elephants like Star Wars that have very few commercial offshoots. But even though half of that 134 billion, or probably a little bit more, half of it goes to the Defense Department, and then of the other half, some of it goes to security agencies that get accounted differently. But a lot of it, essentially, even a lot of the defense R&D spending is now going to support this kind of system of small high-tech firms that I'm about to start talking about. So I wanted to give you a little bit of data to kind of make this, because whenever you tell people that up is down, that the U.S. isn't a great free market utopia, but is actually a state-driven system of innovation, you want to provide people with a little bit of... okay, so I'm going to skip over this. that we did a study. It happens that there's a magazine in the U.S. called R&D Magazine. It's kind of the house organ of the research and development profession. It's read by people in the private sector, in universities, and in the public sector. And they recognize each year 100 products that incorporate cool new technology. And so the people on the juries are mostly engineers. And so the products are things that only an engineer would love, that they're, most of them are so complicated that I have only the vaguest understanding. But we did this study, which was perfect because we just had to plug in the names of the organizations that develop it. We didn't even need to know anything about the ones. So what we set out to do was we picked 3 years in the 70s, 3 years in the 80s, 3 years in the 90s, and 3 years in the aughts. I'm still recycling this study 5 years after it was finished, but it's still relevant. So we figured this was a way to kind of get a snapshot of the way that the U.S. innovation system had changed. So essentially we're saying that let's take the U.S. winners. So they recognize 100 products. Generally 88 to 90 of them are developed by U.S. firms. They pretend to be international, but every year 88 or 90 of them go to domestic firms. And so we said, which firms, what kind of organizations, the first thing, and pardon the balloons over here, these were left over from a children's party, but so essentially the first thing is this networked transformation that basically, as you come up to the present, a growing percentage are coming out of collaborations. Now, the way it works is that in the U.S., government agencies are basically prohibited from developing commercial products. So that what happens is that if employees in a government branch come up with a great new technology, they have to find a commercial partner to hand it off to. And sometimes they get a few royalties or something like that. So pretty much everything that develops in the public sector is ultimately interorganizational because they hand it over to a private firm to actually put onto the market. So the next slide shows this very substantial, that I assure you we didn't cook this data, but it really behaves quite remarkably. So what you're seeing here are the Fortune 500, the biggest corporations in the U.S. When you go back to the 1970s, they were still developing a substantial number of award-winning innovations in their own laboratories. Sometimes a small number, in collaboration with other firms. That's the difference between solo and total, is the ones that are the results of comparisons. So that by the time you get up to the aughts, the Fortune 500 companies have ceased to be an important part of the story. What we see is that as they decline, what rises are the public and the mixed entities. So the tall bar here are the federal laboratories, and the key ones here are the leftover laboratories from the nuclear program. That this is Los Alamos, Sandia, Lawrence Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge. But then there are others that get sprinkled in that basically, under pressure from Congress to expand their mandate. They're still working on nuclear weapons and other kinds of defense programs, but they've been encouraged to work with private industry to, in their spare time, come up with new ideas, and they've become essentially central to the U.S. innovation system. That the federal labs are now playing the role that the Fortune 500 were playing, a generation ago. Okay, the smaller things here that this category are supported spin-offs. These are small firms that have gotten federal money to get underway, so that they're basically under the wing of the federal government, many times under this program, the Small Business Innovation Research Program that I'm going to talk about next. The last are universities, and the university contribution is actually fairly small here. It's a little bit more complex than that, because what often happens is an idea that comes from a university-based scientist then moves to a federal laboratory where it's pushed further towards a product. And so this kind of understates the centrality of the universities to the system. Okay, so the last thing that we did was we wanted to kind of get a metric of how important the federal government role was. So we couldn't do this for all the years because it involved too much work. But for 2006, we had 88 total domestic R&D 100 award winners. And so we, I guess, something like 60 of them were already coming from federal labs, or some agency which was partly public was already a participant. But then of the remainder, we found that were being developed by private firms. We could find federal dollars going to those private firms, but to the specific research group that got the prize for developing the product. So that, the ultimate figure is that there were federal dollars in 77 out of the 88 award-winning innovations in 2006. So the idea is that the tentacles of this developmental state are reaching into innovation across the whole private sector. And that's the other thing about this data source, is that the data source, the R&D awards, part of their requirement is that the product that wins the award has to be for sale on the market, so that it excludes a lot of the fancy Defense Department junk that, the really cool new weapons, because they're not for sale on the market, so they can't be entered into the competition. So in that sense, the awards are biased towards the civilian side, and even so, it shows that this system extends into, and again, part of that reason is because a lot of these technologies now are dual-use technologies that the military or the security agencies are interested in them, but they also have commercial applications, and so they're supporting them for both sets of reasons. Okay, so I wanted to kind of focus on this one program that's kind of very much beneath the radar, but that my co-author and I, Matt Keller, have been making the argument that this particular program has been absolutely central in the success of the U.S. model. Now again, the starting point is this huge federal investment in building and maintaining these laboratories, a huge creation of a university-based science and research system, which is very heavily funded by the federal government in biology, physics, chemistry, other scientific disciplines. But the point is that those investments don't turn into innovations automatically. And so this SBIR program, it was launched in 1982. Reagan was president when they signed the bill. And essentially it started, and it continues to be, a set-aside program. So today, 2.5% of the R&D budget of every federal agency that spends more than a certain amount on R&D has to go to small firms defined as fewer than 500 employees. And different government agencies administer this program differently. Sometimes it's done as grants, sometimes it's contracts. But the idea is that these small firms come up with an idea for a new commercial technology. They apply for a phase 1 grant, which the idea in phase 1 is to prove that your product has legs, your idea has legs, that you might be able to turn it into. And there's a very tight peer review system for these grants. They're actually double peer reviewed. They're peer reviewed for their science, and they're peer reviewed as whether the business model that's been submitted makes sense. So the idea is that phase 1 gives you something like $150,000, carries you for 6 months or a year, and then you can apply for phase 2, which the amounts fluctuate somewhat, but it's now about $1 million. And the idea is that this is the program that every spin-off firm basically starts with. In other words, that if you're a scientist and engineer, whether you're university-based, federal lab-based, or working in a private corporation and you have an idea for a new product and you're not, tied up by the intellectual property claims of your boss, maybe even if you are, you can walk away from your current employer, set up a little firm, and apply for the SBIR grant. And it has become essentially the dominant mechanism for funding these startups. And the story that we're trying to tell is that everybody stresses the centrality of venture capital to the U.S. innovation system. But it turns out that the venture capitalists, are looking for, the next Microsoft, the next Google. Most ideas they turn away, and a very small share of the venture capital money goes to early stage technology development. So the characteristic thing is that when these startups go to venture capital, the venture capital firms say, why don't you go through the SBIR program, move your technology closer to the market over the next 3 years, and then come back to us, when you're close to the market, because we want to organize that IPO or sell you to a big company, and you need something which is really close to the market. So this is kind of the context for this inquiry, that basically what we found was that over the same period of time that we've been looking at the R&D 100 companies, that there had been this dramatic transformation in the location of the private sector science and technology workforce, that they essentially had voted with their feet, walking away from the large corporations. So this explains why the Fortune 500 declined. Many of them essentially, as part of being lean and mean and downsizing and so forth, just simply shut down their R&D operations altogether. They adopt open innovation. They say innovation is something like legal work. We're outsourcing it. If we need a new product, we'll go out on the market and look for it. So essentially, you get this shift where the big companies are getting rid of their scientists and technologists, and those scientists and technologists have essentially relocated to these small firms. And so the puzzle, because everybody knows that employment at small firms, is unstable. I mean, we also know that working for a Fortune 500 company nowadays is also unstable, but small firms fail at pretty high rates. And so how do we understand why this significant number of scientists and technologists were willing to relocate to the small firm sector in this period of time. And so our answer is that the SBIR program is a critical piece of that story, because the figure is now close to $2.5 billion a year is coming into these small firm sector from this SBIR program. And then the other piece of the story is that the SBIR program is also a gateway to federal procurement, so that the federal agencies are often giving the grant to the firms that are developing a new product that the federal agency would like to buy en masse. So, for example, the Homeland Security Department has used the SBIR to get the development of handheld detectors, for radiation and poison gas and anthrax and all kinds of other things, that they use the SBIR process to connect to those scientists and engineers who have ideas about how to do that, and then they'll buy 10,000 or a million of these products. Okay, so this is the trend line of all of the SBIR grants, these vertical lines here, and this is the growth of scientists and technologists at these working at these small firms. So what you see is that the trend lines match pretty well, so that the argument that this movement of scientists and engineers to small firms has in substantial part been driven by the growth at the SBIR program. So, but the really important thing here is that, look at the scale, that there's something like 7,000 a year of these SBIR grants that are being made, phase 1, phase 2. The STTR is a small business technology transfer program. It's where there's an alliance between a small business and a university or a federal lab as a partner. So that's 7,000 grants a year, phase 1 and phase 2 combined, but that the success rate is about 15%. You have about a 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 chance of your grant being approved in a given year. So that they're basically each year, and again, firms can apply to multiple agencies and they can put in multiple applications. So, obviously it's the 7,000 doesn't represent 7,000 different firms, but maybe it's 6,000 different firms. But that it means that there's a universe of 40 or 50,000 applications a year for these grants that are going through this peer review process. So the scale of this is, as we show in the next, is dramatically different from the scale of venture capital funding for early stage firms. That the other thing about the venture capital funding is that it's obviously been very unstable. It follows the rise and fall of the stock market very, very dramatically, whereas the SBIR program has been substantially more stable. Okay, so have I worked my way through my? Yeah. Okay. So that's good. I don't have to. Okay. So what I'm going to do here now is basically what I'm saying is that the SBIR program it's obviously doesn't do this stuff by itself, but it's kind of like the archstone, the kind of key piece that makes all the other pieces work. That you have the pre-existing investment in federal R&D in these big research laboratories. You have the U.S. with this entrepreneurial culture, a lot of emphasis on small business, persuading scientists and engineers that it's a good idea to commercialize your products. You've got universities and federal labs having technology transfer offices which are suggesting to people to take advantage. You've got state and local programs that are helping firms to apply for the SBIR. But that the SBIR program is kind of the key that makes all of these other pieces work. That's the argument that we're making. Now, I don't want to, I'm going to conclude here over the next 5 minutes by saying that I don't want to draw this too rosy picture. What I'm saying is that unbeknownst to most people, the U.S. has developed this very sophisticated system for driving technology from the laboratory to the commercial space. And it operates across all sectors of the economy. A big part of the push now is around nanotechnology and material science, where there are thousands and thousands of these small startup firms that are pursuing different kinds of commercial strategies. But I also want to emphasize that this system is in a very perilous shape. Its kind of sustainability into the future is extremely uncertain. And that I want to talk about two pieces of that. The first is the federal budget piece, and I think I can do this very quickly because you people live in England, and so you know about austerity. So that basically Obama in 2009 got the famous stimulus through. It represented a huge increase in federal R&D spending in 2009, 2010. We've now burned through, all that money is spent, and the federal spending on R&D is declining. There's actually Congress and the president agreed on these catastrophic cuts to the federal budget. It's called sequestration. It's going to cut federal spending across the board by 7 to 8% a year for the next 10 years. So the science and technology budgets are going in directly into the toilet. That means that the SBIR program, all of the other commercialization initiatives are going to contract. My favorite statistic is that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, spend $40 billion a year on biomedical research, but even with that $40 billion a year, the average age at which a bioscientist gets his or her first independent researcher grant award. So, you've gotten your PhD, you've had a postdoc. At 42, you can expect to get your first independent research grant. I mean, that's really pretty close to making the career totally unattractive. So when that figure moves from 42 to 47, you stop having biological scientists because you can't do the research. It just is no longer an interesting or possible career line. Okay, so the second part of this is that the fatal flaw in the U.S. system is that, and this is where I'm getting very briefly to inclusive growth, is that there's no clawback whatsoever. There's no, other than the tax system, the very imperfect U.S. tax system, which you've been reading about through Mitt Romney. The classic case here is that one of the chapters of the State of Innovation book documents that most of the big biotechnology drugs, the large molecule drugs that have been selling $1 billion a year or more, were actually developed through federal spending. Some of them were literally developed within NIH laboratories, and that NIH then hands them over to a private corporation, which, because of the genius of American politics, that private corporation gets the approval to market the drug and a patent that gives them exclusive rights for 20 years, and they can charge whatever the market can bear. I mean, so they sell these things, you know, which NIH had done all of the spending for. They sell it for, that there are some of these things that sell for, you know, $100,000 for a year's course of the drug. I'm not kidding. I mean, this is not uncommon, but other drugs will cost $20,000 for a year's dosage. So that they are taking money out of the federal budget for the R&D, and then they're taking money out of Medicare and Medicaid and veterans programs because those programs are paying to prescribe those drugs back to their patients. And, you know, that it's crazy, it's unsustainable. There needs to be some mechanism where the firms that are benefiting from this federal R&D are making significant contributions back to finance this R&D system. But the second kind of set of dangers that I wanted to talk about briefly is that as valuable as the SBIR program is, it still isn't sufficient to get firms to the market. That you all know this phrase, the Valley of Death, which kind of describes what the small firms have to go through as they try to get these products close to the market. It often takes 6-7 years, with biotechnologies 10-12 years to develop a product to get it to the market. So the SBIR program will support these firms for 3 years, you know, maybe 4 years, maybe you get an SBIR grant for a related thing, but there's still a lot of firms that are failing in that process. One of the chapters of the book, we describe that the CIA has essentially developed its own venture capital arm to deal with this problem. And that, again, this is something which is hidden in plain view. You can look it up on the web. It's called InQtel, IN-Q-TEL. It's the CIA's venture capital arm. They've taken venture capital positions in about 80 small firms. They help by making those venture investments to keep those firms alive, because a lot of them are like doing advanced data mining technologies, which the CIA thinks will be really useful to read everybody's phone calls and decide who needs to be in prison. Okay, so and then the other side of that failure is that the VC, the venture capital system, isn't really working at this point. It's become very predatory. They routinely say to these small firms, hand over all your intellectual property, you know, and we'll give you $10 million or whatever. So the U.S. is in desperate need of a new financing mechanism, and so it's particularly ironic given the financial crisis, given that Wall Street banks, that Goldman Sachs and Citibank and all the others were taking billions of dollars and using them to buy up mortgage bonds based upon subprime lending at predatory rates to poor people in minority neighborhoods. That the point being that the Wall Street, the major financial institutions, are not funneling capital to this kind of high-tech, small firm development. These firms are cut off from the availability of capital. So when you look internationally, Germany looks pretty good because they have had and maintained this system of relational banking where the banking institutions provide ongoing loans to support small businesses, small, medium, and large-sized businesses, and that the Germans have also developed guarantee programs where the risk is distributed across a number of different entities, different levels of government. You need some kind of mechanism like that in order to nurture, in other words, that the genius of this system is that innovation is no longer funneled through a handful of big firms, that there's a potential for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, literally millions of innovative firms coming up with new ideas, bringing them to the market, but we don't have a financial infrastructure to support that and to invest in that risk-taking. So I'll stop there and take some questions.
Do you want to pick your own? Or
Sure,
yeah.
I can do that.
I think it's easier. Questions? Comments?
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Although you haven't made my world so much upside down as I have already heard Mariana lectures and so on, there is one aspect that actually was puzzling to me because concerning this third turning point, many authors ascribe a bigger role not to the Small Business Act but to the Bayh-Dole Act. So I wonder how does it fit your story, the reform provided by the
Okay, so the Bayh-Dole Act is the one which essentially says that universities can retain the intellectual property that results from federal grants. And so that's one of this package of different measures that's introduced in this period from 79 to 89. There's a parallel act called Stevenson-Weidler that does the same thing for the federal laboratories that give them ownership of the intellectual property. And then there's others that pieces of legislation that allow cooperative research and development agreements between the federal labs and private firms. So there are a lot of different pieces of legislation which are put in place, and essentially they're helping to create the incentive system. The complexity is, the problem in every area of social policy is that people are looking for magic bullets, and they'll imitate one program, pull it out of context, and say this is the magic bullet that does everything. And I'm not trying to say that SBIR is a magic bullet. I'm saying it's a magic bullet when it's connected to all of these other pieces of the story. There's a fair amount of literature showing that Bayh-Dole has very uneven impacts, because what happens is that all of these universities say, oh, we're going to get rich from patenting, we're going to get all kinds of royalties. And so there's some universities, Wisconsin, has patents that go back to the 1920s and that produces like $100 million of revenue a year. There are a few universities which have done really well, but it turns out that, and then there's this drama that plays out where the police in the technology transfer office, they have their ears to the ground and they heard that somebody in biochemistry has a cool new idea, and they knock on the door and they say, how come you haven't registered with the technology transfer? We want to get a patent. The professor says, get the hell out of here, and because people don't want to be interrupted. Blah. So it turns out that there's studies showing that as a consequence of Bayh-Dole, there's an increase in university patenting, but the quality of those patents declines because, in fact, people are being coerced to file patents which they think are stupid, and nobody ever cites those patents again. So I could go on, but part of the argument is that in a million different ways, the existing patent system, the structure of patent law, is an absolute nightmare, and it has become an increasingly central obstacle to advance. I'll just say this, that one of the great paradoxes of the free market model is that they say, the state shouldn't be doing anything like I'm talking about. That's betting on winners. The state can't do that. It would be. But then the same free market people say, but the state must enforce an intellectual property system, which includes having a patent office where you have bureaucrats with 2 or 3 years training deciding which of these thousands of applications it represents a real advance over knowledge, and they have to correctly certify which ones are and which ones aren't. So, in fact, the Hayekian argument is an extremely powerful argument as to why the current patent regime can't work. And what's really interesting here is that around the world, in every patent office, I mean, that under the TRIPS agreement, every country has to develop its own patent office and coordinate with the international rules. And in every country on the globe, that the people who run the patent office can't keep enough trained people, because after 3 or 4 years or 2 or 3 years of working there, and they're good enough to make reasonably accurate decisions, 2/3 of the time, that they're skilled enough for the private sector to hire them away at twice the price, to argue and to provide support for legal fights over patent rights. So it's an unsustainable system. But I could go. Yeah.
Is there any push within these SBIR grants for the eventual product to be kind of reinvested into GOCs or SOEs, state-owned enterprises? Because it seems like then the return on the investment would be that much more direct for the government than as if it was a product that could be eventually picked up by venture capitalists that are going to turn into another market, and then eventually the government gets the money back through the small taxation rate on those corporations.
Yeah, no, I mean, because we don't really, that the concept in the States of a state-owned enterprise is basically illegitimate. So, it's part of the ground rules of the system that if there's money to be made, it's going to be made by a non-state entity. And so that's why figuring out a mechanism for gain sharing for the government to get some of the fruits of its investments back is so urgent. And the idea that I've been pushing without very much success is the idea of a share levy. Robin Blackburn developed the idea of a share levy for other purposes, but basically the idea is that every time a new firm incorporates, they would put aside 2% of the shares and give them to a national innovation fund that was run by the government. That agency would hold the shares for at least 10 years and then could sell them in an orderly fashion. And so that way, Google, we all know, came out of a National Science Foundation grant, that was the basis for the secret sauce of the Google algorithm. So if the federal government from Google's incorporation had 2% of the corporation, when Google was worth $200 billion, that would have been $4 billion that the government could use to reinvest in producing the next Google. So it's a way to make it a circular system where the successes finance more successes.
Yeah, it's like the institutions that are using the innovation have to be somewhat accountable for paying for the grassroots innovation that they're actually using on their products. So it's
right,
not just up to the government.
and that's why I push this network failure argument, which is that it's kind of true by definition that if every successful product involves this complex dance, among 20 different organizational entities, that the market doesn't coordinate that very well or at all, and public sector agencies actually play a critical role in coordinating that complex dance that connects those 20 different entities. And so the payback is, in a sense, the payback for network services, that the government program officers are the switch people on the network, and so they should be getting some kind of cut of the network traffic. Yeah. Back there.
I was wondering that when under the SLKR grants, most money goes to small and medium enterprises, which do have quite a hard time to continue on existing. is there any research on where the IPR of the developed products, the process where developed with federal funding ultimately ends up? Does it end up with Fortune 500 companies buying up failed companies?
That's a frequent occurrence. So there have been studies done by the National Research Council, and they tend to show that about 50% of the phase 2 grants end up in an actual product reaching the market. And I don't remember, it varies by agency, but in a lot of cases, the small firm has essentially sold either its entire corporation or the IP for that particular product to a big firm. So I said at the beginning that it's not that the big corporations don't innovate, it's that they buy innovation as an input on the market. And so you see this with the iPhone 4, the big thing with Siri, the voice recognition system, that came from a DARPA grant. The DARPA grant was essentially to develop a personal assistant for the warfighter on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, so they could talk to their little phone and say, is there enemy nearby, and that technology that DARPA was developed by a little Silicon Valley company. Apple first purchased it as an app for the iPhone, and then they bought up the company and included it in the iPhone 4. So that's a big part of what's going on, is that all of these big corporations now have their tentacles out and are essentially looking for good IP that they can buy. So I'll stop.
Do you think that this corporate behaviour is going to result in the next big bubble? There are predictions that singularity is going to just another bubble.
Well, sure. There's a distinct risk, although one of the interesting things in this cycle is that remember, like the Facebook IPO, which has been this disastrous failure, was a fake IPO in that the inner group, Zuckerberg and his friends, had these super shares, and they weren't really selling control of the corporation. I mean, so it kind of is an indication that this system is breaking down. There have been very few IPOs. There have been very few successful IPOs. So, I mean, that's part of the reason that I'm very skeptical about the VC IPO storyline. I'll say this, that basically if you kind of look at the kind of backstory to the financial crisis, that what was basically happening is that the hedge funds were competing with private equity, were competing with venture capital to hire the smartest MBAs out of Harvard and Yale and so forth. And so there was this extraordinary, in the boom, bidding up of salaries. And so that's really what's killed venture capital, because venture capital, unlike foreign exchange trading, is a retail business. The venture capital partners are carrying at any point 5, 6, 7 deals. That means they're working with 5, 6, 7 companies that they're nurturing along to that IPO payoff. So it's labor intensive, unlike foreign exchange trading, where you can turn over 100 billion in a day or whatever, and record 3 billion in profits. So the compensation structure derived from the financial markets gets applied to venture capital and essentially wrecks venture capital, because you can't make that much money out of those 6 or 7 deals. So everybody starts to cream, to just look for the future Googles and Amazons, and they're not there. I mean, that the Facebook failure being an indication. So it's a kind of mismatch because it's still this mindset that all the action is over here with the big Fortune 500 companies, when in fact you have a new innovation economy which is made up of these small and medium-sized enterprises, and that nobody's figured out a durable financial mechanism to fund them and allow them to survive. And many of them, I should also say, is that selling out to the big guys is often a forced decision because, they just don't have a roadmap to the financing to remain independent. A lot of these people don't want to, sell their little baby to, a giant corporation, which will do God knows what to.
But don't you think that the future economy has more to do with the global mode of production? For example, we've got techno-capitalism, which is based on its mode of production on mode of communication, which is not really enough to sort of...
I mean, in other words, I think that that there's a big picture story that that we have a global savings glut in some fundamental sense, and yet we have all kinds of investment needs for human capital, infrastructure, clean technology that's not being financed, anywhere. And so there's a global mismatch between the ways in which the financial markets are channeling capital and the actual needs. So I completely agree. In the back.
Thanks very much. This has been really interesting. I kind of wanted to go back to the issue kind of coordination on this, because I think it's interesting thinking about the case of the U.S., how there's been all these various different actors going in various ways, and in a certain extent, success of the Googles and the Facebook have almost been kind of spillovers of various other types of defense investments and things like that. And so, in that sense, a lot of what we see here, this ecosystem almost kind of seems to have been kind of from a bottom-up effect, or something of a bottom-up effect, but arguably, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But on the other hand, one of the things that we often get in the UK and in Europe is a particularly top-down approach. So government says, we believe that we need to have the UK having more R&D in this area, therefore we're going to invest X amount of money in this much. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on the tension between kind of the bottom-up form as possibly seen in the US versus the more kind of top-down things that you might see in the UK or indeed other countries that are trying to develop these sustainable emerging forms of growth and things like that.
Well, I think that I would kind of resist that way of dividing it because it obviously has to be both. And in the U.S. system, I mean, the DARPA model is that you get these really smart program officers. They're already plugged into a very deep scientific and engineering network. They have a map in their head of what's possible. They go out and they start giving out money to people that they think are doing. So that model centers on identifying a technological barrier that has to be overcome. So it's essentially channeling the bottom-up effort, towards solving a particular technological problem. Now, the issue is that sometimes the smartest people don't know which technology is going to overcome that barrier. So, like biofuels, how do you turn excess, weeds, plant matter into biofuel? And so, what they're doing in the U.S. is, let 100 flowers bloom. I mean, a lot of funding of 15 different types of initiatives to get there, handing out the money, hoping that people at the bottom, and they don't just have to hope, that there's a huge amount of scientific and entrepreneurial effort out there so that the two of those things kind of come together. One of the historical points is that DARPA starts in 1958. 1958 is also the year of the kind of founding moment, it wasn't really the founding, but it's kind of seen as the founding moment in Silicon Valley when the Traitorous Eight leave Shockley Semiconductors and spin off their own firm. That was kind of seen as the original spin-off. So there is a kind of close connection in that DARPA was a decentralized, post-bureaucratic organization at the federal level, and it was working very often with these small spin-off firms. One kind of little footnote there is that we saw an interesting illustration of this with the Obama administration and the stimulus bill, that it's been federal government policy for a while, going back to Clinton, to try to get big auto to move towards electric cars. The Clinton administration had a big program called the Program for a New Generation of Vehicles. They bribed the big auto companies to come to the table and work on these new technologies. Big auto took the money and didn't do anything. I mean, they said we can make a lot of money selling SUVs, thank you very much. This time around, well, first of all, the Obama administration had a certain kind of weapon because GM and Chrysler were both bankrupt and the federal government had saved them. But they also, recognizing that not even being saved from bankruptcy was being a sufficient weapon, they said, okay, we're going to give a big chunk of this money to Fisker and Tesla, small startups to produce electric vehicles, and even 10 years ago, the idea that the federal government, that anybody would fund a startup in the auto industry, was completely crazy, but that it was completely rational because it was the DARPA model that you work with both small firms and big firms, and you use the small firms as a lever against the big firms, telling them if they're not going to play the innovation game, you can work around them. I mean, so that's in effect what they were doing.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting talk. I'm interested in what you might have to say about comparing the US SBIR with the SBRI in the UK, which is, even in its acronym, it's closely modeled after the US SBIR. So there were now 3 years of data out for the UK SBRI. It had a hesitant start. There's no monotonic growth. It seems to be fizzling out. There's a small number of applicants, and also the average grant size is quite small. Is there anything that should be done to improve this? I mean, the UK doesn't have such a big defence sector. Maybe that's the missing ingredient. Maybe the UK should keep throwing more money into this SBRI thing. Maybe you should envisage wider changes throughout the innovation system. Is there anything you would suggest?
Well, I mean that first of all that. I don't, I haven't studied the UK system, so I'm not, So from what I've been told, we've seen this, and we see this all the time. I mean that this kind of policy imitation, which is like being divided by a common language. I mean that it's frequently the case that we'll borrow a program from you, or you'll borrow a program from us, and drop out the key content, but call it the same thing and say you're imitating. And we do the same thing. And so I think that the scale is so much smaller. And I've been told that your program doesn't have this kind of peer review aspect, and that's kind of absolutely central to the U.S. system, that it's doing this critical evaluation. Again, the venture capital people, they're too busy to separate the wheat from the chaff, or even to give feedback. Because when you apply to SBIR in the U.S., it's like putting in an NIH grant or an NSF grant. I mean, you get peer review, that say, this is a good idea, but you haven't, met the following 17 objections. And people revise and resubmit, and they learn. I mean, so that kind of running the same kind of program without peer review is, like the proverbial Shakespeare play without the prince in it.
If someone has
Oh, okay.
so it's fine. Otherwise, I can make a question.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Very interesting talk with lots of interesting notions. One thing that I wanted to ask is you have these SBIR programs, and they seem to be very successful, at least for a decade. Is part of the success the way in which bids are given? Because there's all this money, because then it also depends on how you use it. Right? It's really the way in which the firms are selected, the projects are selected, the sectors in which they're selected. It's probably all part of the success of this program. So do you know anything about these details which...
Well, let me kind of give you one of my favorite stories. There's I don't know whether these things are available yet, but the new generation of lighting is solid state lighting, these LED bulbs, and we can now buy them in the market, and like for $35 you can get this light bulb which is 9 watts. It lasts for years and years, and that I have one over my bed now, and it's kind of like an interrogation lamp. For the first time I can read in bed and actually see the page, but if I mistakenly look up at the light, I'm blinded for about 2 minutes. Well, this is there's a firm called Cree Lighting that it began in North Carolina State University. There was a material scientist. He ran an electrical current through silicon dioxide and got some light. And he said, hey, maybe we can, produce light in a different way. He didn't set up the firm, but a group of his graduate students set up the firm in the 80s. They applied repeatedly to SBIR. They got like 5 or 6 different SBI awards. And then they got into the military procurement system because, they were promising a new kind of lighting which was dramatically energy efficient. They were progressing towards, closer and closer to the market through the 90s. It's now $1 billion a year corporation. The federal support was enough so that they didn't have to sell out. They were obviously under pressure to sell the firm and the technology to Sylvania or GE or whatever. But they've now reached the market. This is now a mature technology. The bulbs, are way too expensive for ordinary consumers, but it's one of those, because the key to it is like a silicon chip, that as production, as output rises, the price is going to fall quite dramatically, like silicon chips. And it's a huge transformation in lighting, reduces the electricity needs dramatically. So it's that story, multiplied by thousands, of lots and lots of these scientists and engineers having a cool idea and building a firm and so forth. So it doesn't really answer your question, but it's but again, that.
But there is a selection process.
There is a selection process,
which is determinant here.
Yeah, so that they are, as I said, there's a double peer review for technology and for business, and so that they're not giving repeated grants to companies that aren't getting anywhere. Yeah, Ryan.
And what's happened with the Stevenson-Weidler Act? Has it actually worked? So are federal labs actually retaining the intellectual property? And if so, what's sort of happening on that front? They get some royalties, and but
I think I don't know. I mean, I think it's again part of the ideology that the royalties are never very, very great. One of the things which I've become obsessed with is that the federal labs have a program called Work for Others, and it's literally that the private companies will come in and say, we've got this technological problem, there's a barrier we can't overcome, we'll pay you $1 million, to work with our scientists, with your equipment, over the next 2 years. So essentially, in the land of the free market, where the motto is that if you need to have something done, go to the private sector. The reality is that the private sector, thousands and thousands of times a year, is going to the federal lab and saying to people who are on the federal payroll, help us solve these problems. I think that I can't remember the numbers, but the total volume of work for others with the private sector across the federal labs is, I think, on the order of maybe $200–300 million a year. But it is on a kind of upward trajectory, and that the labs are under enough budgetary pressure that they basically have to, they have to tell the firms, for these projects where the labs, are getting no intellectual property rights. I mean, they have to charge something. But again, that's the underlying principle of the U.S. system is socialize the costs, privatize the profits. The nanotechnology initiative that began under Clinton basically involved building of big nano lab. This is kind of oxymoron, a big nanotechnology lab, but expensive sophisticated nanotechnology laboratories were built on about 10 or 15 campuses around the country, and that they sent out word to industry, don't bother investing in your own lab facilities, send us your experiments, we'll run the experiments, and give you the results. So that's a kind of typical way in which the U.S. system works, is that nothing's more expensive than building high-end laboratories. There's no reason that you in the private sector should worry your pretty heads about doing that. We'll assume that cost and help you. And this is one of my favorite stories, so I'll tell it, that there's a really good book about DARPA and the Strategic Computing Initiative in the 1980s. And what the DARPA people realized was that the big technological barrier in the computer industry was in microchip design, which was that only the big fabricators had the money to fabricate a new chip and test it to see whether it was good. So there was a barrier that you had to have a lot of resources to persuade a fabricator to turn a chip design into an actual chip. So it was a bottleneck for technological development. So what DARPA did was that they created a laboratory called MOSIS, M-O-S-I-S, that was affiliated with the University of Southern California. And the purpose of that laboratory was that you could, if you were like even if you were a graduate student in computer science, you could email them your design for a computer chip. The laboratory would make 5 of them and mail it back to you, and you would get, 2 weeks later in the mail a box of your computer chips. And so it broke the bottleneck, because anybody, who was within the system could design a chip, and it was enormously contributed to the acceleration of new chip designs. So that's kind of one of the models that works through the whole system, is where can we find a bottleneck? How can we spend some money to break that bottleneck open? Yeah.
I have just a quick question about that chart of the number of scientists, engineers, that we see the Fortune 500 going down and the small going up. I wonder whether it could disguise spin-offs from the Fortune 500 and subsidiaries that are smaller than 500 employees. So are they allowed to apply for the small business grants?
No, they've been pretty. There actually been big fights as to whether a firm which has venture capital investment, is eligible, and they fiddled with that a little bit. They're pretty tough about it. So that a subsidiary wouldn't be eligible. I mean, you really do have to be independent.
Okay, I think we actually have to stop because there's another class that's
Okay.
going to Okay, well, thank you very much.